Hello, my name is Ani Shahinian. I recently defended my doctorate at the University of Oxford. Today, I will speak on the life of a medieval Armenian manuscript, the transmission of sacred texts across space, time, and communities. The Armenian collection at the Library of Congress has a rich and extended history. The first record of Armenian materials documented in the acquisition reports at the library dates back to 1901. By 1920s, the Armenian collection expanded, holding all types of materials. By the 1940s, we have genocide survivors establishing funds under their family name for the purposes of acquiring Armenian language texts for the library. As the cataloging efforts of the Armenian materials develops in the 1950s, the manuscript for our study today comes out from its hidden dark shelves into the light. During my summer residency at the library, I was captivated by the story of this particular Armenian Gospel manuscript held at the Library of Congress. Besides the fact that it is the oldest manuscript, what captured my imagination was the power of this artifact to hold the histories of the people who encountered it. The transmission of how the manuscript arrived at the library tells the power of artifacts and how they carry stories across space and time for new cultures and communities to encounter the past in a new way. However, it is meeting the people and their cultures in their particular environment that shed light on the very question of what it means to be human. One particular theme that runs across the diverse background of nearly 700 years of this manuscript is the message of healing. Each time the gospel is transmitted from one hand to the next, it holds a narrative of what it means to be a whole person. According to the history and the tradition of the invention of the Armenian alphabet, Mesrop Mashtots from the 4th century invented the Armenian alphabet to translate the Bible and holy writings from Syriac and Greek into Armenian. Copying the 4 Gospels was especially popular amongst the Armenians. It is nearly impossible to know how many gospel manuscripts survive today, but in Jerusalem alone, from which this copy of the gospel comes, there are well over 1,000 gospel manuscripts. This gospel manuscript was copied in the year 1321 by a highly active monk named Nerses Abera in Jerusalem at the Armenian monastery of Holy Archangel, seen here in this photograph of the church. The photograph was taken in 2018. Nerses Abera copied other manuscripts, including homilies, festal works, lectionaries, and other liturgical books. However, this particular work was not known nor included in these studies. In other words, this collection at the library adds to the copies compiled by Nerses Abera, otherwise lost to history. Prior to explaining how and when the library acquired this manuscript, which include an extraordinary set of events, I would like to digress for a moment and explain 2 important documenting methods in the Armenian manuscript tradition. First, Armenian scribes had a practice of leaving colophonic memorials at the end of their copied manuscripts. This included details like details about their times and their circumstances. In the last 100 years, these colophons found in the manuscripts have been compiled and used to fill the gaps in various parts of history otherwise lost. Here we have a colophon at the end of the gospel manuscript that tells the socioeconomic conditions of the monastery in Jerusalem and the Cilician kingdom and the rulers of the time. It even expands on the difficult conditions that surrounded the scribe when he was working on the manuscript. He writes, quote, "I beg you all, each and one of you, who encounter in this text an error when reading, do correct it with love and do not mock at it because I wrote it in times filled with suffering, when the Muslims rose up against the land of Cilicia and plundered it and carried off many captive." Additionally, the colophon confirms names and places at the time of the composition of this manuscript. It details that the manuscript was written when King Oshin had died and his only son, Levon IV, or Leo, became the king. Here in this slide, we see the depiction of King Levon by a famous Armenian Cilician painter named Sarkis Pitsak, who was active in the 14th century. Much later colophon, written in a modern hand, tells the transmission of the manuscript from Jerusalem to Ottoman Turkey. We are told that Philippos Yerets, or priest, purchased the gospel books, an avetaran, from Kyriakos Yerets for 60 tairi. I have not been able to trace this currency, and it is possible that it is not a coin, but some other type of market commodity used for bartering. There was a currency called talir, a German currency used during the Ottoman Empire, but we do not know for sure. Presumably, Philippos from Van purchased this manuscript during a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, a very popular activity, from a local priest named Kyriakos. Another small tidbit from the colophons places the manuscript in a small village of Harpert province, modern-day Elazığ, Turkey, under the care of a man named Khachatur Minasyans. Up to this point, the question of how the manuscript ended up at the Library of Congress remains unresolved. Fortunately, along with the gospel manuscript, the library has preserved a letter dated July 22nd, 1891, addressed to a gentleman by the name of Dr. Henry Foster of Clifton Springs, New York. Although this story of the manuscript has been interesting thus far, it was the discovery of this letter and the content of this letter that really changed the way I viewed this artifact. So, who is Dr. Henry Foster? What is in this letter? Who wrote it? And finally, what is the connection to the gospel manuscript? Before discussing the content of the letter itself, allow me to introduce a few women from the late 19th century who bring to light some interesting connections. This letter is written by a missionary who was stationed in Harpert, Ottoman Turkey, named Mary Page Wright. First, where is Harpert? Here we have a slide that shows the map of Harpert, found on the hushamadian.org, a project that reconstructs Armenian villages and their life in the Ottoman Empire. This map is representative of the time when Miss Wright was serving in Harpert. Miss Mary Wright's story is one of a devout missionary sent to Ottoman Turkey by the American Board Commissioners on Foreign Missions, Protestants of several denominations, including Congregationalists and Presbyterians. We learn from some of the letters preserved in the libraries of Harvard, Yale, Columbia universities, the dedicated and sacrificial lives and works of these missionaries. We also learn about their hardships. For example, Miss Wright had health problems, and her time in Ottoman Turkey was interrupted by visits to doctors in the States. This is an important point I shall return to later. encountering this particular story of the American missionaries associated with this particular manuscript and the account of history which otherwise would remain unknown opens a wide-ranging discussions about the indirect contributions the missionaries made to our overall understanding of the last few decades of the 19th and the first few decades of the 20th century. Returning to the letter, Miss Wright states that Caroline Bush, another missionary to Van and Harpert, who had also a phenomenal story of experience with the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, presented the gospel manuscript to Dr. Henry Foster of Clifton Springs, New York. In this talk, I will mostly focus on Miss Wright and Dr. Henry Foster. Exploring Miss Bush's life deserves a separate study. From the letter, we are told that Dr. Henry Foster consulted Miss Mary Wright to understand what was in this manuscript. And in her explanation of the manuscript to Dr. Foster, Miss Wright makes observations and thereby sheds light on some of the socio-religious context that otherwise might be taken for granted. I will explain a bit more. Miss Wright states that this manuscript of the gospel, the four gospels, is, quote, written in a dead language, though all the rituals of the Gregorian or Armenian church is in the same tongue, close quote. Having spent nearly 30 years in missions in Turkey, she makes this observation. None of the, quote, none of the common people understand it, and not all of the priests even, close quote. This is the first level observation Miss Wright makes. Then, upon examining the content and the structure of the gospel manuscript, Miss Wright concludes that there are differences between the Armenian and the English gospels. She observes that there are no chapters, no headings. There's more. She then says, quote, so far as I have examined in the contents are like our gospels, except that the story of the woman in the 8th chapter of John is omitted here and placed at the end of the book together with the preface, as it would be called in a modern book, close quote. By preface, she is referencing here the colophons we discussed earlier, and I will return to her comments on that shortly. But first, what I would like to make a few observations is the following. It is fascinating to me that Miss Wright found the Agripha text, that is the chapter 8, verses 1 to 11 in the Gospel of John. This is the story of the adulterous woman, perplexing for her. She was familiar with the English version of the Bible where the story was uncontested part of John 8. However, this is not so in the early traditions, and Miss Wright made this observation as she examined the manuscript. Some theologians consider it a genuine part of the Gospel of John, while others view it as a later addition. Another view, based on thorough study of the syntax, grammar, and word association, suggests that the pericope actually belongs in the Gospel of Luke. In this particular example of the Gospel, we see a case where the pericope is included at the end of the Gospel, not unique in particular to the Armenian Gospels, and we do have many examples of this. Then, Miss Wright expands on the colophon, highlighting historical information such as the reign of King Leo IV and, quote, the deportation of the Muslims that is going on in the province of Cilicia at the time, close quote. Then she highlights the section in the colophon where Nerses Abera writes about the first 3 councils of the churches. It is interesting that in the parenthetical aside, Miss Wright notes that in his description of the councils, Nerses, quote, expressly narrows himself as a Monophysite, close quote. Besides the usage of the Monophysite term, Miss Wright describes that, quote, the absence of the allusions to the Virgin Mary or to the saints make the transcriber as one of uncorrupted faith, such as one of Nerses Khala in the 12th century, close quote. Here, she's referencing to Saint Nerses Shnorhali, one of the great saints of the Armenian Church, whose 850th anniversary is being celebrated worldwide this year, including ceremonies and conferences in the Vatican, Europe, Armenia, America, and elsewhere. What connects these different cultures, people, and traditions? Here we can experience something quite interesting. One American missionary's observation on the two Christian traditions. It was Miss Wright's assumption and how she understood this ancient church tradition that through her Protestant worldview, which made the intra-religious and cross-cultural study possible through the life of this particular manuscript, we observe how Christianity has passed down in space, time, and communities, and how this one manuscript holds in its memories to tell the diverse stories around the one gospel manuscript. It connects the dots between these diverse communities in Jerusalem. Here in this slide, we have the ancient, within the walls, the city walls of Old City Jerusalem, Van, Harpert, and also in Harpert, where the manuscript was last known, in a village called by Horetzi, to the other side of the ocean in Clifton Springs and then Washington, D.C. This last map is to capture and connect the dots between these geographic locations, but also the communities that lived there. Having finished her examination, Miss Wright seems to have forgotten to comment on the leather cover of this gospel manuscript. She adds a postscript to her letter to explain the procession in the Armenian Church, in which the priest holds the gospel for the congregation to walk up to the front and kiss the silver cross on the gospel. She then makes a very interesting observation, that is, the cross on the gospel has been removed. Here in this photograph, and as I'm holding here, one may see where the cross imprint and outline is visible, and how the silver cross was held together to the leather cover. The two questions that remain unresolved in this story of transmission of this artifact are: what was the connection of Caroline Bush, the missionary, to Dr. Henry Foster for such a donation? And thereafter, how did it end up in the library after being stored in Clifton Springs, New York, under the care of Dr. Foster? Having already introduced the two women who were responsible for much of the transmission of the gospel manuscript, as I bring this talk to a close, I would like to introduce Dr. Henry Foster and his wife, Miss Mary Edwards Foster, who was the great-great-granddaughter of the famous American Enlightenment theologian Jonathan Edwards. As we learned, Caroline Bush acquired the manuscript during her missionary years in Van and Harpert, Turkey. What brought her to Clifton Springs, New York? The answer, in many ways, is hidden in the story of the life and works of Dr. Henry Foster. Born in Vermont in 1821, Dr. Henry Foster grew up as a Christian with a strong sense of conviction and purpose. From early on, he was known as naturally gifted physician. He eventually pursued his medical training in Utica, New York, with a prosperous medical career ahead of him. He contributed to numerous medical journals, became the editor of the Grafenberg Report, and could be described as a flawless researcher with unparalleled talent. However, Dr. Foster had a turn of events in his life. According to his biography and in his own words, he experienced a life-altering encounter with God and was given a vision to build a wellness center in Clifton Springs, New York. That would completely be free of charge. And so he went forth to fulfill this calling. In 1849, he moved to Clifton Springs and established a water cure center. In this slide, we can observe his home in Clifton Springs, which is a museum now, active, with a village historian and a doctor who recount the many stories and memories of Dr. Foster, the man who left a mark on that village and the number of lives he came to touch. And on another note, I find remarkable about Dr. Foster was that he not only generously offered his water cure services free of charge, but he exhibited such an ecumenical and inclusive heart and openness to help and provide supplies for such a wide variety of Christian denominations and communities with graciousness. Here in this slide is the tabernacle that he built and assisted in funding for the missionaries. This slide also is the group of missionaries right in front of the tabernacle and where the missionaries met in Clifton Springs, New York. One can read more about Dr. Henry Foster as shown on this slide. And upon his passing of Dr. Henry Foster, Miss Mary Foster donated the manuscript to the Library of the American Board of Foreign Missions, which upon the closing of the library in 1950s, it was donated to the manuscript. The manuscript was donated to the Library of Congress. As we reflect on this rare manuscript and explore the life of the man who preserved it, Dr. Henry Foster and those who preceded him, we are enriched with an opportunity to weave together the forgotten stories scattered across space, time, and diverse communities. From Nerses Abera in Jerusalem, a fellow doctor of souls, to Dr. Henry Foster, a physician who through all of his visions and efforts sought to serve both man and especially women in their physical and spiritual well-beings by building a center for foreign missionaries to come to Clifton Springs, New York for their retreats, their annual gatherings, and their overall recovery. Through offering free homeopathic wellness services to these missionaries, he helped restore them and empower them to return to their mission fields, where they continued serving God by meeting the needs of poverty-struck villages before, during, and after the massacres and the genocide that was taking place in the eastern provinces of Turkey. And we today have the privilege of reading and discovering these treasured stories here at the Library of Congress. I hope that this has been an inspiring story, and I hope that as you listen to it, you find inspiration for today. Thank you for listening.